This study looks at communicating evidence in forensics. Before we get started, I'd like to say a few words about the task, the interface you'll use, and why we feel this is important. Fingerprint examiners compare fingerprints obtained from crime scenes similar to these. Because the fingerprints are often degraded, the impressions are compared by humans, not by computers. Fingerprints are unique, but so is every impression made by a finger. The job of a fingerprint examiner is to look at the latent impression collected from a crime scene and compare it against an exemplar impression collected from a suspect or retrieved from a computer database. The fingerprint examiner must decide whether there is enough evidence to conclude that the two impressions were made by the same finger, or whether there is enough evidence to conclude that the two impressions were made by different fingers. The amount of evidence is accumulated in the mind of the examiner, supported by charts and notes. The examiner has to communicate the results of that comparison to a detective, judge, or jury. An examiner accumulates evidence in support of one or two propositions or hypotheses. The first is same source, the two impressions came from the same finger, and the second is different sources, the two impressions came from different fingers. Note that we typically never know which of these two propositions are actually correct, but we can accumulate evidence in support of each. This evidence scale describes the range of support that different conclusions might imply. The top of the scale is the same source proposition, which is the most support imaginable for the proposition that the two impressions came from the same finger. The bottom of the scale is the different sources proposition, which is the most support imaginable for the proposition that the two impressions came from different fingers. In the middle is equal evidence, which is the point on the scale where the evidence for the two propositions is equal. Different comparisons might result in different levels of support for the two propositions. If the crime scene fingerprint is distorted or only a partial copy of the finger, there may not be much detail to work with when doing the comparison, similar to these. Other impressions might be higher quality, and this might result in more evidence in support of one of the two propositions. To communicate the results of the examination, the fingerprint examiner typically relies on a conclusion scale, which has various statements that communicate different levels of support for the two propositions. For example, the two fingerprints below are obviously different, suggesting more support for the different sources proposition than the same source proposition. The one on the left is a whorl, the one on the right is a left loop. In other cases, there might be a lot of detail and agreement between the two fingerprint impressions, suggesting more support for the same source proposition than the different sources proposition, as shown with these images here. Fingerprint examiners have various phrases to express the strength of support for the two propositions. It is important that the phrase they use is interpreted properly by others, such as detectives, judges, or jury members. The goal of this study is to allow you to express how you interpret the meaning of different phrases if spoken by a fingerprint examiner. We're going to show you different phrases and ask you to place them on an evidence scale. Here, we've added numbers where 100 represents the strongest evidence imaginable for the same source proposition. Minus 100 represents the strongest evidence imaginable for the different sources proposition. 0 represents equal support for the same source and different sources propositions. You will use this scale to help express how much support you believe each conclusion statement implies about the two propositions. Note that the scale is stretched at the endpoints to help you make fine judgments about different statements that are close to each proposition. To get started, imagine that you are on a jury and the fingerprint examiner has presented fingerprint evidence along with a specific phrase that expresses their conclusion. We are going to show you a series of phrases and ask you to tell us how you would interpret the level of support each phrase implies for the two propositions if each were spoken by a fingerprint examiner. Let's go through the interface and I'll explain how it works. Once you finish the video, you'll see a screen that looks like this. This is our sorting interface that allows you to read each one of our statements as well as the definitions for each of those statements, and then to sort them in terms of the order for most evidence for same source at the top to most evidence for different sources at the bottom. So I'll move same source up here and then different sources down here, and now they're in the correct order. And this is just for practice to learn this interface. And then you'll click the check button, and if it's correct, you'll get to see this screen right here. Click the start button, and then move the same source statement up to the top here. This is again just for practice to learn our interface. Move the equal evidence to here, and then move the different sources all the way down here. So next you go on to the next scale, and your scale might look different than this one, but what we'd like you to do is to read each statement and then the definitions, and then sort the statements by most evidence for same source at the top to most evidence for different sources at the bottom. So I'll move this one up here, and that seems to sort them there. And then click the check button, and if they're correct, then you'll move on to the next screen. This is where the experiment actually begins. So what I'd like you to do is to read this statement, review the definition if you need to, and then think about the location of this statement along the evidence axis from same source proposition to different sources proposition. Move this statement to a location that corresponds to the strength of the evidence for same or different sources that you believe that statement implies if stated by a fingerprint examiner in court. So I won't bias you by telling you where I would place this. I would say that just move it to a location that satisfies that strength of the evidence that you feel like this implies. And once you've placed that, you can click the Add Next Phrase button. And then you'll move this one to the correct location, the location that you infer from this statement, referring back to the definition if you need to. A couple of things about using this scale. First of all, the different statements can overlap. That's certainly fine. The second thing is that you should preserve the order. So if you feel like one statement is slightly higher in terms of strength of the evidence, you should place it above another statement. And you can go back and move different statements if you need to, even though they're no longer read. And then even though we put numbers on here, we would like you to treat this as a scale that goes from 100, which is most evidence for same source that you could ever imagine, to minus 100, which is most evidence that you could ever imagine for different source proposition. And 50 is sort of midway between equal evidence and same source, and minus 50 is about midway between different sources and equal evidence. So use that scale as you like. When you're done with the phrases for a particular scale, it will go on automatically to the next scale. And once you've worked your way through all of the scales, there'll be a screen with some demographics, and you can work your way through those. And then you'll be done with the experiment. So we feel like this experiment is really important in terms of helping forensic examiners think about how to make a conclusion that is interpreted properly by a judge or a jury or a detective, and does so in a way that accurately represents the strength of the evidence. So we appreciate you thinking carefully about the definitions of each statement and thinking about where it would lie on the evidence axis from evidence for the different sources proposition all the way up to evidence in favor of the same source proposition. Thank you so much for your help with this.